This new Blood Surge setup is doing significantly more damage, and in this video I'm going to break down everything that you need to know about the new setup. We're going to talk about the speed farming variant, we're going to talk about the farming variant, we're going to talk about how to solve essence issues, we're going to talk about everything that you need to know about Blood Surge to start destroying everything. Now, if you're new to Blood Surge, it is generally regarded as Necromancer's best overall build. This build does ridiculous damage, bro.
Ridiculous.
And it does that damage while being extremely mobile and completely unkillable. Now, you can see my gear is going to be pretty decent, but I am missing an extremely important role on my necklace, which is Tides of Blood. That means this footage you're seeing on the screen is not even close to the peak of what this build can do. Yet, despite that, I have already cleared a Pit 100, and I do that having over 25,000 life. I'm completely unkillable, face-tanking boss mechanics, clearing a Pit 100 with good gear, but not perfect gear. This build is absolutely phenomenal. So let's start with something that I have been asked repeatedly since my last video, which is how do you solve the essence issue? Now, essence issues are largely coming from the Great Feast aspect, because this is going to be continuously draining your mana. For speed farming, you need to drop Great Feast and you need to run Sacrificial. That is going to completely solve all of your mana issues right away, and that's what I do whenever I'm farming Torment 4. Now, if you want to do harder content, Great Feast is a much better multiplier, but the Essence Drain can be kind of annoying when you're speed farming because you're killing enemies so fast, the Soul Rift doesn't have time to restore your resource. But whenever you take longer to kill enemies, you can easily pay for Great Feast. So that's the issue you're seeing. Now, let's move on to the new version of the build. What has changed that has over doubled the damage of the build? The answer is the Shroud of False Death. This aspect is completely broken, and the reason for this is because it has a ginormous amount of all stat, which is effectively intelligence, right? It also gives you armor from the strength, but mostly it's the all stat. It has a huge maximum HP roll, and the other stats on it barely matter at all. But the other thing it does is it gives you +1 to all of your passives. Now, because of this, we're getting the extra rank of Imperfectly Balanced, we're getting the extra rank of Titan's Fall, we're getting the extra rank of Fueled by Death, Tides of Blood, Coalesced Blood. All of these different pieces are getting this huge multiplier from the Shroud of False Death. But there's a problem. There's a huge problem with this, which is where do I put Embalmer? Because if you don't, Blood Moon Breaches, right? 150% multiplier. You got to run these. Perdition, 60% multiplier, +6 to core skills. Crit chance, lucky hit. You got to run this. Where do you run Embalmer? Because Embalmer is completely broken in this build. And it ends up being the best slot is to put it on your necklace. By putting Embalmer on your necklace, you're going to be generating ginormous amounts of blood orbs, and you're going to be able to do that while also running the Shroud of False Death. And remember, if you're new to Blood Necro, every single blood orb we generate, every single blood orb we pick up reduces the cooldown of Rathma's Vigor by 2 seconds. So we're going to get lots more overpowers. Look at this footage you were saying. Look at how often I am overpowering. I am literally overpowering like once a second with Blood Surge. That is completely ridiculous. This damage output is wild, and you're going to see some 4 billion damage hits while I'm overpowering that frequently. And remember, those 4 billions you're seeing, that is multiplied by the blood-bathed aspects because you're hitting those 4 billions twice. And what you're not seeing is a ton of like 200 to 300 million damage hits from the extra drain on Cures and Brace. This build is absolutely obliterating, dealing loads of damage. So, as I mentioned before, there are 2 major variations for this build. The first is the Uber Blast Speed Farm version, which is the one that you should play pretty much always. And the second version is a push version of the build that's designed to do a lot more damage, but it's a much slower version of the build. Now, it's actually extremely easy to swap between these builds. They rely on all the same engines, same skill tree, same paragon, all that stuff. You just have to swap a couple of rune words. So let's start by talking about the rune words themselves and the overall playstyle of the build, because it's a question I get all the time of like, am I using cast while moving text? How am I casting and moving at the same time? Like, how is this being played? So the best rune words are going to be Mani, which is cast a skill after moving, and Tam, which is going to be cast a skill. So the way that this is going to end up looking is I'm actually going to permanently hold down left click, so I'm always walking, and then I'm going to spam right click. And what's going to happen is I'm going to keep moving around, like for example, on a boss fight, I'm going to keep walking in circles around the boss while spamming Blood Surge. And the whole time I'm doing that, I am picking up blood orbs. Those blood orbs are giving me huge amounts of damage, and they're also lowering the cooldown of Rathma's Vigor. It is super important to be spam moving, right? So I'm just holding left click, walking, and spam right clicking. And you can see with these rune boards we're running, right? We're constantly proccing the cast a skill after moving, and we're constantly proccing the cast a channeled skill. So, or sorry, a non-channeled skill. So we're able to sustain both these rune words very easily. Now, we're going to be running the Zale rune all of the time, which is going to give us 20% maximum life. This is for the increased damage. And you can see, like, when it's procced, I don't have all my buffs right now, but you can see I'm at 20,000 life. But this, when I'm fully buffed up and everything, I'm actually going closer to 25,000. But you can kind of see why we're always running this, right? It's a ton of damage for the overpower. Now, on the other rune word, this is actually going to vary based on if we're talking about the speed farm version or the push version. For the speed farm version, we are going to be running Jaw, which is going to allow us to cast Sork Teleport after we cast the skill while moving 16 times. On the other hand, when you're pushing, you're going to be running Horrid Decrepify, which is the Watt rune, which will auto-cast Decrepifies. This is extremely powerful for pushing. The reason it's so powerful is because it's going to give you the Execute, so enemies are going to start dying at 10% health instead of at 0% health, and it's going to apply your curse with all of the buffs, including the cooldown reduction buff on Decrepify. Finally, this is going to free up an aspect slot, so we're able to slot in the aspect of concussive strikes, which, you know, has a lucky chance to stagger and has a built-in damage multiplier on it. So this ends up being incredibly powerful because it's going to be decent uptime on a 20% multiplier against general trash. Because remember, this build ridiculously good at proccing lucky hit, right? But there's one other thing that makes this item so good for pushing, which is that it staggers bosses. Staggering bosses is extremely important, and it gives you a huge amount of damage against them. We're running the control glyph, we're playing the concussive strike aspect, and we end up getting a lot of multipliers against CC'd enemies, and by slotting in this aspect, we're able to stagger bosses extremely easily. One other question that I was asked a ton was, how do I improve my damage? And the answer to that is actually pretty straightforward. This build gets most of its damage from only a couple of places. If you have all the mythic uniques and you're still not doing a ton of damage, you need to look at two main things. The first of which is your Creator's Embrace. This item represents a huge amount of your damage. If you have a poorly rolled one, no GAs, not ancestral, and especially if it's not masterworked, you're going to be losing out on a ton of damage. Especially if you're struggling against bosses, the single most important thing in the entire build, not even like Paragon, no Uber Unique, nothing will solve this. The most important thing for your single target is Blood Surge additional drains from elites. Because remember, the additional drains themselves are also doing bonus damage, but they're also scaling up the damage of the Blood Surge, like the Nova itself, right? Because the Nova scales per enemy you drain up to 50%. So every additional drain that you can get is going to increase the damage of that Nova by 5 extra percent. So not only does each additional drain increase your damage by 12% per drain, but it's also going to give you another 5% onto the Nova. So each additional drain, like each rank of this one stat in single target is like 14 or 15% damage. So you can see I'm all the way up to a +7. If you're rocking a +2 right now, you're doing like half as much boss damage as I am just from this one stat. So it's super important. The other stats on this item are also all extremely good. Maximum life, straight up multiplier for your damage and survivability. Ranks of Blood Surge, straight up multiplier. Tides of Blood, huge multiplier. That stat is extremely good. And you can see why these gloves are so important. You need to level these up if you're having low damage. The other thing that's really important is your amulet. Now, as I discussed at the start of the video, I am missing my Tides of Blood roll. This is a huge deal. I'm missing out on a ton of damage. But you need a triple passive amulet. This is going to represent the most damage you could possibly get on it. You can see right now I have 16.7% intelligence, which is a huge multiplier. 5 ranks to collect blood. That's 6% per rank, so that's 30%. 4 ranks of imperfectly balanced, that's another 20%. And you can start to see how important the amulet is. Invest in your gloves, invest in an amulet, and you're going to find your damage skyrocketing. There's a couple of more like specific minor things I want to talk about too with damage. Those two things are the most important, but your Ring of Starless Skies is also very important. Make sure you upgrade this item. But the other thing is these blood attack speed temperings. You need blood attack speed on everything. It is such a good stat. Now, for speed farming, you do want you want Soul Rift duration on your necklace, but for pushing and for all content, you need blood attack speed on your ring and on your 2 weapons. This is super important. It's a huge multiplier. The other thing you really need is chance for Blood Surge to do double damage on both your main hand and your offhand. Those are also huge multipliers. Each one of these literally multiplies your damage by the number it says. So this is 34%, this is 30%. So you can start to see, like, You know, if you're missing half your damage on your gloves, you're missing another 50% here, you're missing 30%. You can start to see why you're doing like 6 times less damage than I'm doing. It's because you're missing all of these pieces. These are all multiplying into huge numbers. So get your glove upgraded, get your necklace updated, get those right temperings, and you're going to start destroying, just like what you're saying in this video. Now, another question I get all the time is, which weapon should I use in this build? And the answer is that what's most important is the stats on the item, way more important than what weapon you're using. Blood attack speed, really high roll, chance for blood surge to do double damage, very important, and GA ints and GA max life are all ginormous damage multipliers that are going to impact your build way more than any additive damage. Now, that being said, there are a couple of things that we need to discuss with weapons. So, for starters, daggers and wands have a faster attack speed than your other options. I think wand is typically what I would personally prefer to use, but you can see I'm using a dagger and all this footage is totally fine. But I like the faster attack speed on wands. It has a nice damage implicit. This is a good item. Like I said, not as important as all the other stats, but still a good item. The other option to run is the mace, which has the much bigger additive damage on it. The mace ends up being more overall DPS than the dagger or the wand, but for speed farming and stuff, the dagger and the wand are really nice, but again, the other stats are so much more important, guys. But if you want to know, that's the answer. And for your offhand, make sure you're running a focus. Do not run a shield. Shields suck. Run a focus. It's going to be your best in slot. But anyway, I think that's pretty much the majority of the questions I've been getting about this build. This is the new version of the build. I hope you guys like it. If you had any other questions, if you think there's other stuff I should talk about, let me know in the comments below. I'll answer all your questions. And thank you guys for watching. I'm Ruse Cruz. I'll see you in the next video. Peace out, everybody.